This film documents the Vietnam War in the words of Americans who served there. It features home movies and rare archival footage collected during a worldwide search, and now presented in high definition. Many scenes are graphic in nature, and viewer discretion is advised.
You know, they say the World War II guys were the best generation. Well, those who fought every war since then were the best of their generation. They went, they served, they sacrificed, and they fought like tigers. They were noble.
Now when you're feeling low and the fish won't bite, you need a little bit of soul to put you right. You gotta make like...
Right before school let out, all my teachers wanted to talk about was the battle between communism and democracy taking place in Vietnam. Most of us had barely heard of the place before. I may not know much about Vietnam, but communism is something else. Growing up during the Red Scares of the 50s, we've all heard about the horrible things that happened in communist countries. I suppose it's a threat, all right, but at the same time, to be honest, it feels kind of far away. Even for me, it's hard to imagine how something on the other side of the world could really affect any of us in San Bernardino.
America's involvement in Vietnam began in 1954, when a political treaty divides the country in two. Communist China and the Soviet Union support the North, while the United States backs the South. Fearing the spread of communism throughout the region, Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson provide South Vietnam with military and financial assistance. By the spring of 1964, Vietnam is becoming a hotspot in the Cold War. More than 16,000 U.S. advisors are training South Vietnam's army to battle a homegrown guerrilla force known as the Viet Cong, or VC. With the support of the North, the VC are working to overthrow the South Vietnamese government and reunite the country under communist rule. But what has been primarily a civil war is about to change.
The first time I came out here, it was almost hard to believe that such a pristine landscape could really be hiding tens of thousands of enemy infiltrators. Only my South Vietnamese counterparts were quick to remind me of the truth. They've been fighting and dying in these jungles for almost 10 years, struggling to stop the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong from taking over their country.
24-year-old Lieutenant Bob Kluel is serving as a military advisor to the ARVN, South Vietnam's army.
Our orders are to accompany the ARVN units we're assigned to on field
operations. Primary purpose for being there was not to engage the enemy. Our primary purpose for being there was to advise the friendly nation or force and let them engage the enemy. That's how it kind of got started.
By the fall of 1964, the South Vietnamese government is in political disarray, while its military is crumbling under the advances of nearly 150,000 Viet Cong soldiers, who control nearly half of the South Vietnamese countryside. Supplied with weapons and reinforcements from the north, the Viet Cong are farmers by day and fighters by night, capable of launching hit-and-run attacks and then melting back into the jungle, undetected. Both the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese view the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution as a declaration of war by the Americans, and they intend to fight. In the pre-dawn hours of November 1st, 1964, the Viet Cong launch a surprise attack on one of the 4 U.S. air bases in South Vietnam. It is their first direct assault against U.S. personnel inside the country. 4 Americans are killed.
We had advisors and military assets in South Vietnam for years. The Viet Cong had never intentionally tried to destroy them.
An allied force of more than 8,000 men today.
On February 7th, 1965, Viet Cong forces strike a second U.S. airbase. 8 Americans are killed, and another 126 wounded. Weeks after the Pleiku attack, President Johnson authorizes a large-scale bombing campaign inside North Vietnam. Codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder, the strategy is twofold. Cripple the North Vietnamese war effort by destroying military and industrial targets, and crush their will to fight by demonstrating the awesome extent of American power. U.S. command believes both objectives can be accomplished in just 8 weeks.
This operation may be only scheduled to last 8 weeks, but I intend to get in as much flight time as I can before it's over.
31-year-old Captain Keith Connolly is flying an F-100 Super Sabre with the 416th Tactical Fighter Squadron as part of Operation Rolling Thunder.
I had never been to war. In fact, I didn't understand what war was all about. So obviously we were very, very apprehensive about this, but everybody thought in the back of their mind that the war was going to be over. It wouldn't take long for us to show up with our awesome firepower and do the things that we had demonstrated out in our training ranges that would bring the enemy to his knees. They weren't going to be able to sustain themselves with this awesome capability of the American forces.
But the start of Rolling Thunder has brought an unexpected problem. The American pilots and planes stationed inside South Vietnam are vulnerable to Viet Cong attack. So to protect them, U.S. commanders want ground troops sent to Vietnam for the first time. They ask President Johnson to approve. Johnson knows that the ground troops will be seen by the American public, as well as North Vietnam, as a step towards a larger war.
Every night before I turn out the lights to sleep, I ask myself this question: have I done everything I can to help unite the world, to try to bring peace and hope to all the peoples of the world. Have I done enough?
On March 8th, 1965, at 8:15 a.m., 3,500 Marines with the 9th Expeditionary Brigade land in South Vietnam. For the first time since the Korean War, battle-ready American ground troops are setting foot on the Asian mainland.
Yeah. Down that way. And especially all the compounds. All the
Half of these guys never even heard of Vietnam before they got here. Now they're getting one heck of a tour.
United Press International correspondent Joe Galloway is with a platoon of 40 Marines patrolling outside the U.S. Air Base at Da Nang. Their orders are strictly defensive.
I nagged the hell out of my bosses to get here and cover this conflict, but now that I'm here, the VC don't really seem like that much of a threat. I don't think any one of these Marines has even seen a communist yet. I know I sure as hell haven't. But then again, the VC are guerrilla fighters. They know how to hide in plain sight. Back at base, guys are hanging out in each other's hooches, screwing around and listening to music. Feels more like a college dorm room than barracks in a war zone.
You know you make me wanna shout, kick my heels up and shout, throw my hands up and shout, throw my head back and shout. Come on now, don't forget to say you will. Don't forget to say yeah, 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 yeah. Say you will. Say it right now, baby. Say you will. Come on, come on.
A lot of guys keep coming up to me, wanting to tell me their names and hometowns, so hopefully I'll mention them in an article and their folks back in the States will see it. I think it's kind of cool. Sort of makes me feel like Ernie Pyle. He won a Pulitzer for reporting on the Grunt's Eye View in World War II. I'd read Ernie Pyle's columns and I thought
if you're
going to cover a war,
that's the way to do it. I was very impressed with how he covered his generation's war. And I wanted to do it the same way, covering the soldiers as far forward as you can get.
these guys all fully expect to get the job done and be home in a couple of months. Although for my sake, I kind of hope it doesn't end too quickly before I get a chance to write about some real action.
When I first left for this assignment, I told my wife I'd be home before the summer's over. I figured there was no way a little third world country would even come close to competing with our firepower. Now I'm starting to see how wrong I was.
Captain Keith Connolly and his fellow pilots are 3 weeks into Operation Rolling Thunder, the 8-week-long air campaign intended to bomb North Vietnam into submission. So far, the results are falling short of expectations.
Coach 6, I'm taking fire. I'm coming back up.
Doesn't seem to matter how much destruction we inflict. The North Vietnamese rebuild everything. And then we get sent back up here to hit it again. There's a frustration level on behalf of the
pilots. Sometimes we'd be going back to the same areas, hitting the same targets repeatedly, and not understanding why we were being targeted into the same areas over and over. And it dawned upon us that this war was not going to be over in a short few months.
An allied force of more than 8,000 men today tightened its hold on the Bataan.
On March 30th, 1965, the Viet Cong explode a car bomb in front of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. 22 people are killed, and 183 more are injured. Over the next 3 months, VC forces continue to attack U.S. and South Vietnamese installations throughout the country, while the South Vietnamese army proves powerless to stop them. With South Vietnam nearing collapse, the head of U.S. operations in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, makes a momentous request. He asks President Johnson for permission to take the offensive and for the first time use U.S. ground troops to seek out the enemy and drive them out of the South. On July 28, 1965, in a press conference televised to the nation, Johnson announces his decision.
I have asked the commanding general, General Westmoreland, what more he needs to meet this mounting aggression. He has told me, and we will meet his needs. I have today ordered to Vietnam the Air Mobile Division and certain other forces which will raise our fighting strength from 75,000 to 125,000 men almost immediately. Additional forces will be needed later, and they will be sent as requested. This will make it necessary to increase our active fighting forces by raising the monthly draft call from 17,000 over a period of time to 35,000 per month.
By the fall of 1965, 150,000 American soldiers have descended upon South Vietnam. 250,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong are poised to meet them. The newly arriving Americans are about to get more than they bargained for.
God, you can feel the excitement building. We finally got intelligence that 200 NVA soldiers are in the hills of the Chu Pong Mountain.
UPI reporter Joe Galloway has joined up with the 1st Cavalry, one of the Army's new air mobile assault units. After months of fighting small, frustrating skirmishes, U.S. forces are preparing to launch their first major assault against 200 North Vietnamese soldiers using an experimental new tactic, air mobility. Equipped with UH-1 Hueys, the 1st Cavalry is designed to insert soldiers into combat using helicopters. For this encounter, they will make their first attempt at inserting a force of 450 Americans. to fight the 200 NVA. But as the men prepare for battle, a potentially serious problem weighs on the mind of the commanding officer, Colonel Hal Moore. The spot where they will land, a small clearing designated Landing Zone X-Ray, was chosen because of its close proximity to the enemy. It is too small, however, to land more than 8 helicopters at a time. With each chopper able to carry only about 6 men, it will take several hours to get all 450 soldiers on the ground.
Any commander's fear in a case like that, if you land and you've only got a few of your troops, less than 100, and the enemy comes on you, you're in a bind. If you go down, the LZ is the landing zone is closed, and whoever's in there dies.
At 10:19 a.m., Firebase Falcon, 5 miles from the landing zone, lets loose a vicious barrage of artillery into the enemy positions. The 28-minute onslaught is meant to clear the LZ so the helicopters can land safely. At 10:35 a.m., the first U.S. choppers lift off and begin the 13-minute flight to the landing zone. Four miles outside of LZ X-Ray, the choppers drop to treetop level. In front of them lays a landscape of smoke and exploding U.S. ordnance. The barrage is intricately timed to stop just 1 minute before the soldiers hit the ground. If the timing is off by even a few seconds, they will risk being hit with their own artillery.
I was staying close to the tent where the radios were.
Radios were at brigade headquarters, so that I could hear if anything started happening.
This is 6-5, we have negative contact, all the birds have blown to us.
Now another 200! Bravo Company is sweeping the area around the LZ. So far, all is quiet. Already the choppers are delivering the second load of soldiers. Everything seems to be going according to plan until 11:15 a.m. Bravo's first platoon captures a single, unarmed NVA soldier. He's immediately taken to the command center for interrogation. At 11:20, the prisoner makes an incredible revelation. He tells the interpreter there are 3 full battalions of North Vietnamese soldiers on the mountain, and that all of them want very much to kill Americans. It's unbelievable. 3 battalions, that's almost 1,600 soldiers. No one can believe what they're hearing. We've got less than 200 men on the ground, meaning we're outnumbered 8-1.
Roger, say again.
Within minutes, U.S. and North Vietnamese forces are locked in vicious combat. While the men on the ground desperately attempt to keep the North Vietnamese from overrunning the LZ, the pilots of the 1st Cavalry continue to ferry in the remainder of the 450 men amid a vicious torrent of enemy bullets and rockets.
There are things about battle that movies cannot teach you, and that is the true, horrendous noise of battle. bullets cracking, bombs landing, artillery shells exploding, people screaming. It's just a cacophony that's almost deafening.
After nearly 8 hours of battle, casualties are mounting and supplies are running low. But with night fast approaching, all further landings must be called off until dawn. The 450 battered Americans are on their own and will have to survive the night in the face of an overwhelming enemy.
Last night, the enemy launched several small attacks against our lines. The dead still lay where they were killed. It's too dangerous to try and move them.
Joe Galloway is the only correspondent at Landing Zone X-Ray. Of the 450 soldiers on the battlefield, 85 are already dead or wounded. Those still alive are desperately in need of ammunition and supplies.
Word is that reinforcements are going to try and land a few miles away and try to fight their way over to us. God, I hope they make it.
At the base of the Chupong Mountain are nearly 1,600 enemy soldiers. A few hundred yards in front of them stands only a thin line of Americans, pounded and exhausted from nearly 24 hours of constant fighting. The enemy's sporadic attacks during the night were to determine the most vulnerable points in the U.S. lines. Now they know the best way to breach them, and they are preparing to put this knowledge to use.
At 6:50 a.m., 200 NVA soldiers hit C Company's 1st and 2nd platoons. Company commander Bob Edwards is shot through the shoulder, leading his men in a counterattack. His XO, Lieutenant Arrington, runs up to assist, but within minutes he is also shot, right through the chest. The enemy is within 75 yards of their lines. Some of the men are down to hand-to-hand combat. At 7:15, NVA soldiers hit Delta Company, right where they connect with Charlie Company. The line is starting to break down. Enemy's bullets are passing right
through the command area where we were sitting. And I just fell over on my belly and got as flat as I could. And finally, Colonel Moore looked at the Air Force liaison lieutenant, Charlie Hastings. Moore looks at him and says, "Call Broken Arrow." Broken Arrow was a code at that time, meant that an American unit was in dire danger of being overrun and wiped out. And when that call was given, every available fighter bomber in Vietnam diverted to that place to deliver their bombs.
I'm going in now. 9 o'clock. Burning.
was about then that I heard Colonel Moore yelling, "Get him off of us, Charlie! Get him off of us! Call that SOB off!" And I looked up, and there are two F-100 Super Sabre jets like this. They're coming directly at us. The lead plane has already punched the pickle switch and will turn loose canisters of napalm. Hal was trying to stop the second guy from dumping his on us. But unfortunately for 2 or 3 engineer demolition guys, they were right in the path. And in that flame, I could see these 2 men dancing and screaming. And someone yelled, "Get this man's feet." And I reached down and picked him up, and his boots crumbled. The flesh on his ankles just peeled off. I could feel the ankle bone in the palm of my hands. And we carried him over to where the wounded were. It was a young specialist named Jim Nakayama out of Rigby, Idaho. Married. Wife had a baby that week. He died 2 days later. That boy is my nightmare.
By the time the fighting ends, a total of 234 Americans lay dead. With enemy deaths estimated at nearly 3,000, U.S. commanders come up with a new strategy. The lopsided 12-to-1 kill ratio convinces them that in this war without a front, body count will be the measure of success. And the helicopter, which is proven capable of operating in the midst of intense battle, will be an important weapon in executing this strategy. U.S. commanders now believe they have found the blueprint for total victory in Vietnam. Surprise of the Tet Offensive resulted in quick victories for the enemy. Within days, the NVA and VC are being driven out of almost every major city hit during the attack. But while the American military begins to triumph, the real cost of the Tet Offensive is becoming clear.
1, possibly 2 armed personnel carriers that preceded us in here have been blown.
Unlike World War II, news coverage of Vietnam is not subject to government censorship. So as hundreds of war correspondents cover the battle, the images are broadcast into the homes of millions of Americans.
The infantry will move back into the tree line
hoping to re-establish contact with the Viet Cong.
Vietnam gives the American public their first unrestricted view of the graphic images of war. February 1st, 1968, an NBC cameraman is filming South Vietnam's chief of national police in Saigon when a Viet Cong prisoner is brought to him. The ensuing image becomes a symbol of the war's brutality.
The Tet Offensive made it clear that the Communists had changed their tactics. But they didn't do it overnight. Despite optimistic reports to the contrary, it's been changing for a long time.
U.S. and Vietnamese troops.
3 weeks after the January 31st surprise Tet Offensive began, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces have successfully driven the NVA and VC out of almost every major city hit during the attack. Khe Sanh still remains embattled, but for the most part, the U.S. military is returning to its strategy of search and destroy, chasing the retreating enemy into the countryside. The Tet Offensive becomes a turning point, not only for the U.S. military, but for journalists covering the war. On February 27th, CBS anchor Walter Cronkite, known as the most trusted man in America, returns from a week-long trip to Vietnam and steps out of his role as a reporter to offer his personal view on the war.
To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion. But it is increasingly clear to this report that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
National politicians seize the opportunity and openly speak out against the war. The senator from Minnesota, Eugene McCarthy, challenges President Johnson, his fellow Democrat, for the party's nomination for the coming election, and nearly defeats him in the New Hampshire primary.
Our history of this war in Vietnam, no matter what we call it, has been one of continued error and of misjudgment. And many of us in the Congress followed patiently.
With his administration in turmoil and public support for the war at just 41%, Johnson addresses the nation.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Tonight I want to speak to you of peace in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. No other
He orders a halt to the bombing of North Vietnam in the area where 90% of the population resides, and announces an effort to start peace talks to settle the war.
50 million human beings.
He then drops a political bombshell.
With American sons in the field far away. With America's future under challenge right here at home. With our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day. I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
For 3 years, peace talks between the United States and North Vietnam have been going on in Paris, with little or no progress. In January of 1971, the talks remain deadlocked, as do the private meetings between National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and North Vietnamese negotiator Le Duc Tho. Nonetheless, President Nixon is moving ahead with his policy of Vietnamization, the plan to eventually turn over all combat responsibilities to the South Vietnamese Army, known as the ARVN. As a result of the ongoing U.S. withdrawals, pressure is increasing, not only on the ARVN, but also on the remaining Americans to carry the full load of combat operations. Since the start of the war, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the enemy's main supply route into the South, has been a thorn in the side of the Americans and the South Vietnamese. After years of heavy bombing failed to sever the trail, a 1970 ground incursion into Cambodia finally succeeded in destroying a massive amount of enemy weapons and ammunition. Now, U.S. and ARVN commanders hope that a similar assault against the northern end of the trail, located in Laos, will result in the destruction of an even greater amount of supplies and disrupt enemy operations long enough for Vietnamization to take hold. Codenamed Operation Lam Son 719, the plan is to send an armored South Vietnamese force speeding down Highway 9 to the village of Chapone, which is believed to be a major enemy supply depot. At the same time, U.S. helicopter units, including Major Bob Kluel and his men, will insert ARVN ground troops north and south of the highway to act as a blocking force and destroy any additional supply caches in the immediate area. In total, 12,000 South Vietnamese are heading into Laos. And for the first time since American forces took over primary military leadership, they will do all of the ground fighting.
Come on, let's work together. Now, people, because together we will stand, every boy, every girl, and a man.
That was the graduation
exercise. But I'm afraid all it's shown is even though the South Vietnamese soldiers fought valiantly, their leadership is nowhere near ready to take control of this war.
But that is not the message President Nixon delivers to the nation.
Did the Laotian operation contribute to the goals we sought? I've just completed my assessment of that operation, and here are my conclusions. The South Vietnamese demonstrated that without American advisors, they could fight effectively against the very best troops North Vietnam could put in the field. The South
They
Vietnamese
wanted to spin it as a success, but that it should be amply evident to anyone who looked at the situation and be able to understand this war is lost.
Less than 3 weeks after President Nixon delivers his assessment of Lam Son 719, a 5-day-long demonstration in Washington, D.C., organized by Vietnam Veterans Against the War, garners huge publicity and controversy. On the 4th day of the event, VVAW spokesman John Kerry testifies before Congress. He is the first Vietnam veteran to do so.
Each day, to facilitate the process by which the United States washes her hands of Vietnam, someone has to give up his life, so that the United States doesn't have to admit something that the entire world already knows, so that we can't say that we've made a mistake. And we are asking Americans to think about that. Because how do you ask a man to be the last man to die in Vietnam?
The day after Kerry's testimony, the veterans converge in front of the Capitol for their final day of demonstrations. Among them is former Second Lieutenant Barry Romo.
When we get to the Capitol, everyone lines up, and every single person, one at a time, takes the medals they had won in Vietnam and throws them away. And when it's my turn to step forward and throw it down,
and all I said was, these aren't worth shit. I couldn't say anything else. All I could think about, my nephew, I was awarded a Bronze Star with a V, and of course he died to get his. And so all I could think about was the sacrifice that he had made for the same thing that I had done.
Someone told me long ago, there's a calm before the storm. I know it's been coming for some time. I won't know, have you ever seen rain coming down Sunday?
Negotiations continue for the next 3 months, until on January 27, 1973, after continued bombing of the North and much U.S. pressure on the South, all parties finally signed the Paris Peace Accords. Hostilities are to cease immediately, but North Vietnamese troops are allowed to stay inside the South, on the condition that they do not continue to build up their forces or resume aggressions.
I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia.
Years earlier, at the end of World War II, Times Square in New York City erupted in spontaneous celebration. Not so in 1973.
This is Ken Albort in Times Square in New York City, where the major visible observance is the end of the war is the great sign Peace down the side of the Allied Chemical Building. The sign flashed on, and the moving news wire below it signaled the word over and over for a minute. And on this rainy, cold evening here, there were a few around to see it. Times Square, which had filled again and again over the years with crowds demanding peace, and a rather smaller crowd to celebrate its arrival. There were other observances as the hour came.
8 years after the Marines first landed in Vietnam, the war that divided a nation is finally over. And the unwinding of America's involvement can begin. The troubles of Southeast Asia slipped from the daily newscasts, giving way to reports of the Watergate break-in and subsequent political firestorm.
There was talk this weekend that the president should resign and under siege because of the Watergate scandal.
As president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
I, Gerald R. therefore do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute.
By the time Gerald Ford assumes the presidency in August of 1974, U.S. aid to South Vietnam has been cut by 75% since its height a year earlier. For the ARVN, who've depended upon American money and military supplies since 1954, the cutbacks have a devastating effect. Planes sit idle on runways, unable to take off because of lack of fuel. Artillery pieces that had once been allocated 100 rounds per day are rationed to only 10. But while the ARVN supplies are dwindling, the North Vietnamese are rebuilding their military strength. On March 10th, 1975, just over 2 years after the Paris Peace Agreement was signed, hopes for an independent South Vietnam come crumbling down. The North Vietnamese launched their largest and most ambitious offensive yet into the South. As ARVN units begin to falter, hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese civilians run for their lives. On April 21st, President Thieu resigns. 4 days later, NVA forces reach the outskirts of Saigon. On April 29th, as Saigon crumbles, a small contingent of U.S. State Department, CIA workers, and Marines who remained in Vietnam begin a hasty and desperate evacuation of South Vietnamese civilians and government employees who had worked with the United States. Tens of thousands of people scramble onto U.S. ships waiting offshore. As they run out of space for people, millions of dollars of military equipment is dumped into the ocean. On April 30th, just before 8 a.m., the last American chopper to leave Saigon lifts off from the roof of the embassy. Less than 4 hours later, North Vietnamese tanks crash through the gates of the presidential palace. At 4 o'clock, a live radio broadcast announces Saigon is officially renamed Ho Chi Minh City.